First, I want to thank you all for coming here and joining us to talk on the Rohingya crisis. My name is Griselda Elena, and I am in the company of three remarkable people who have agreed to come and engage with us for a talk on the international community's response to the Rohingya crisis. And we're also going to be talking about what role we can play in aiding Rohingya resettlement. At this time, I'm going to introduce each panelist, and then I'm going to give you a brief synopsis of my own work to provide an overview of the topic. So our first panelist right here is David J. Kramer. He joined Florida International University's Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs as a senior fellow in May 2017. Previously, Kramer was Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy at the McCain Institute for International Leadership, President of Freedom House, and Senior Transatlantic Fellow with the German Marshall Fund. Kramer served during the George W. Bush administration as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. He is the author of the recent book, Back to Containment, Dealing with Putin's Regime. And thank you so much for being here, David. Our next panelist is Walid Hamadeh. And Walid is Acting Regional Manager of Islamic Relief USA, as well as the founder of Unitrade LLC, a real estate investment firm based out of Coral Springs, Florida. Thank you for being here, Walid. Our next panelist is Azhar Aziz, and he holds a bachelor's degree in finance from the prestigious Osmania University, as well as a master's degree in business administration. He is currently pursuing his doctorate in Islamic studies, and he currently serves as the Vice President of Community Affairs and Alliances at Islamic Relief USA, which is the largest Muslim charity in the country. He is also the former president of Islamic Society of North America, ISNA, the oldest Muslim organization in the US and Canada. In his capacity, he has advised two former US presidents, President Jimmy Carter and President Barack Obama. Thank you for being here. Can we give them an applause? And even though Hassan is not here yet, he will be joining us. It's important that you know who Hassan is. Hassan Mahmoud is the CEO of Transnational Enterprises and import and distribution company based in Hollywood, Florida. He is a secretary of the Rohingya Foundation America, but his credentials aren't exactly what makes him so valuable to this conversation. Hassan was born in Magda Township in Rakhine State, Myanmar. He left Myanmar to Bangladesh at the age of 9 and lived there for a few years. His father then came to the US for a few years, and after attaining US citizenship, he sponsored and brought the family here to the States through a family visa when Hassan was 16. He knows what it's like to be both Rohingya and American. So you'll meet him when he gets here. As for myself, I'm currently pursuing my PhD in international relations here in SIPA. I'm also doing a graduate certificate in Middle East and Muslim World Studies. I serve as the academic advisor for FIU Honors College. Most of you know this because I'm your advisor. I focus on non-STEM and pre-law students. I have performed fieldwork abroad with UN officials, refugee coalition members, and ethnic minorities, specifically in Southeast Asia. I began to question the systemic state-sponsored persecution of the Rohingya when I was doing work in Myanmar with the Buddhist 969 movement. For my MA thesis, I was able to interview Time Magazine's Buddhist terror, Uwashin Wiratu, to provide feedback directly from the source of the violence for my ethnographic work. I was able to connect how the oppression of women was inextricably linked to the persecution and othering of the Rohingya in Myanmar based on interviews with the 969 monks and Buddhist nuns. So let me give you an overview of the Rohingya so that you know who this group of people are, right? The Rohingya is described by the UN as the world's most persecuted people. They have faced heightened fears of attack since dozens were killed in communal violence in 2012. This is where I began to do my own investigation and journey as I worked with Mon, Karen, Rohingya refugees in Thailand. All three are ethnic minorities fleeing Myanmar's ethnic cleansings. The UN documented mass gang rapes, killings, including of infants and young children, with brutal beatings and disappearances committed by security personnel. I personally worked with these children, so it kind of pulled my heartstrings and it made me kind of want to do something for the rest of my life directly helping this minority, right? In a report, UN investigators said such violations may have constituted crimes against humanity. But yet the ICC began an investigation to charge Myanmar for its crimes, but has yet to file an actual case because Myanmar is not in their jurisdiction. Since August of 2017, more than 750,000 refugees, mostly women and children, have fled Myanmar and crossed into Bangladesh after Myanmar forces launched a crackdown on the minority Muslim community. At least 9,400 Rohingya were killed in Rakhine from August 25th to September 24th in 2017 alone. That information comes from Doctors Without Borders, so they know who they're working with. In a report published last December, the Global Humanitarian Group said that the deaths of 71.7%, or 6,700 Rohingya, were caused by violence. They included 730 children below the age of 5. The US envoy urged Myanmar's government to provide Rohingya Muslims safe return to their homes and grant them citizenship, access to school, places of worship, and medical care. She added the refugees and those who are still hiding in Myanmar must know that their return will be safe and completely voluntary. She noted that Rohingya Muslims must be confident and that they will not face the same abuses that drove them from their homes. Curry also called on the Myanmar government not to confine the returnees to camps or ghettos as second-class citizens and to respect their freedom of movement and basic human rights along with their rights of citizenship. On whether she believes the efforts of the US and other major countries are enough to stop the persecution of the Rohingya, she said that the US was the single largest donor in helping the Rohingya through financial assistance and is working with both Bangladesh and Myanmar to stop the military operations of the Burmese military. The US also imposed a visa ban, restrictions on members of the military, and held Burmese military generals who took part in the violence responsible. So, David, any contribution that you have based on your experiences with human rights is fundamental to this conversation. I'd love to hear your opinions on the crisis and any suggestions that you have for resettlement of the Rohingya, given that no one is really focusing on resettling Rohingya, but instead focusing on the emergency.
So thank you very much. Thanks for including me on this, though I admitted to you and I will admit to the audience that of everyone who is up here on this stage, I am the least knowledgeable person about what's happening in Myanmar. I've only been there once when I was running Freedom House, and that was before the immediate crisis that we're talking about today, though as Waleed was mentioning to me earlier, this is not a new thing. The Rohingya have been victims of abuse many times in the past. This is just the most recent and perhaps in recent memory the worst that we have seen. It is not getting the attention I think it deserves beyond the humanitarian assistance that is being provided. Humanitarian assistance, however, vital and life-saving though it is, doesn't address the root causes of the problem. And that is a situation where governments around the world, not just in the West, but governments around the world need to come to grips with what is arguably one of the worst human rights abuses we're seeing in the world. Sadly, there's competition for that title, with what's happening with the Uyghurs in Western China, the terrible situation in Yemen. But what has been happening in Myanmar is of amazing proportions. And yet, the international community, the response to it overall, I would argue, is pathetic. It's woeful. It's utterly inadequate. There have been very few U.S. sanctions imposed on Burmese army officials. The army really is calling the shots in this country. There is a mechanism through which the United States can impose sanctions that includes an asset freeze and visa denial, and it's only to a handful of officials. One of the struggles with this crisis is that the international community had so much hope in Aung San Suu Kyi. She was an opposition leader. Freedom House, my organization, when I was there, gave her our Freedom Award in 2011. She wasn't able to leave the country to receive it in person, but we were among many organizations that were kind of spellbound, to be rather blunt, with her and had so much hope that she represented the future of that country. And yet, since being the de facto leader without much real power, she has been, in my view, a terrible disappointment, to the point where people have talked about having the Nobel Peace Prize taken away from her, where some organizations, in fact, have rescinded the awards and recognition they have bestowed upon her. And yet, at the end of the day, she's not in a position to put a stop to this, because she's not calling the shots in that country. The army still remains the most powerful force there. There were also many politicians in the United States and elsewhere who were taken with Aung San Suu Kyi, and they have had great difficulty trying to focus criticism and responsibility for what's happening on her because of their past support for her. And yet they have not done enough in singling out the military in Myanmar as being responsible for this. So as a result, we see a situation, Oren and I just were involved in an event on Tuesday marking the 25th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. From the Holocaust, the expression "never again," we seem to be seeing it over and over again, where not enough is happening here. The UN issued a report last year describing the situation in rather blunt terms. The State Department was supposed to have issued a report in which the expectation was that Secretary Pompeo was going to designate the situation as a genocide. Instead, he didn't. The State Department issued a summary of the report. It didn't issue the full report, and the term genocide was not used, though the description of what was happening was rather stark. And so I looked in the State Department website today. The annual human rights report came out, and it talks in rather grave terms about the situation in Myanmar, but Secretary Pompeo has not said much of anything about the situation since being secretary. There was a controversy, in fact, about a leak of the State Department report late last summer, early fall. And there was more focus on the leak of the report than there was about the situation unfolding on the ground. So the international community, I think, has failed in its obligations and its unwillingness to use the term genocide because of the fear that if you invoke the word genocide, you then incur responsibilities to do something about it. The last thing I'll say is there are questions about the International Criminal Court. Neither Myanmar nor the United States is a signatory to the Rome Statute that created the court. And so to move forward on that would require some sort of mechanism or establishment of a special court, as was done, say, for example, in the case of Rwanda and others. But there doesn't seem to be any push in that direction. And some of the other members of the UN Security Council who hold veto authority, specifically China and Russia, certainly are not going to lead the way if the United States doesn't either.
Thank you so much, David.
Well, Hassan is here. Hi, Hassan.
Hassan, I formally introduced you. I let everyone know where you come from, what you do for a living. I want you to tell the audience your experiences in Myanmar as a Rohingya child, and if you ever thought that your life would shape into what it is now, back then.
Hello, everyone. My name is Hassan. I was born in Burma, Rakhine State, the place called Mongro. I left Burma at the age of 9 and to Bangladesh. I lived over there for a few years, um, and came here. But my father came here a long time ago. That's how I got here, uh, through family visa process. As a child in Burma, I actually situation was pretty bad, but still, it like open prison. There was restrictions for everything you do. From traveling to a neighboring village, you need a special permit from the authority. Um, uh, Restriction on education. Even if you get elementary or middle school level education, you couldn't go to college. Also, there was extortion, uh, you know, random raids at your houses by military and demand money. Uh, the list goes on, actually. But I was pretty young back then, and I personally didn't face that much. But in different areas, in different areas, people experience different things. But I never thought that the situation would get to this large scale catastrophe, you know. So, but I knew that it was slowly getting worse. But even then, we had about 1 million Rohingya when I was living there. So now I think 70% of the people left. So, I mean, I don't think that my life would be how it is now if I was living there. I couldn't even dream, because people in Burma, our people, uh, you know, how would I describe this? We could not participate in the country's economy. So you are not allowed to get any government jobs or any types of job because there were no. I mean, it's like apartheid situation. You're living in segregation. You're treated differently from other citizens. We're not considered citizens. We're considered illegal immigrants from neighboring countries, even though our people have been living there for maybe more than 1,000 years, centuries. So we speak very kind of different dialect, which is very unique to us. So I think the systematic oppression, institutionalized racism, has been going on for many years. So it has started in the 60s when the democratically elected government overthrown by the military junta. So since then, situation started to get worse and worse. And right now, from my mother's side, most of the, I would say 90% of the people already fled the country. They are living in, some of them living in Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, Malaysia, and, you know. Um, so it's pretty bad. I think what is happening right now is somewhat similar to what happened in Nazi Germany in the 40s. And when I was living there, it was similar to what it was like in South Africa from 50s to late early 90s. So that's the kind of situation I was living in. So right now, what happened is So basically, militaries are going to villages, burning whole entire villages, and people are, let's say, while they're sleeping, they're burning them alive, or sometimes shooting them. So this is the situation Rohingyas are facing now. So it's a genocide. I don't know how else I can describe it.
Right, and they refuse to call it a genocide. It's funny, well, it's not funny, but you mentioned that the Rohingya remain this group that is called illegal immigrant, right? So when I was doing my research, I remember that I asked the leader of the 969 movement, I said, well, why do you continue to call them immigrants if, they've been here and there's so much documentation that proves that they've been here, as a matter of fact. And I showed him one valuable source that it was, his name's Francis Buchanan, right? And he was an anthropologist who was exploring Southeast Asia back in the late 1700s. And he wrote this book. He published a book in 1799. And he called them the Rohingya, right? So, I mean, obviously, if you're an anthropologist and you're listening and you don't speak the same language, you're just going to write whatever you can. But he called them Mohammedans, obviously a Muslim community. He called them the Rohingya. And he was talking about how they've been long settled in Burma. So, I mean, that alone is a significant source that this group of people have lived there for a very long time. And there's plenty like that source, but I did mention that specific source. And he looked me in the eyes and he said, no, that's made up. And I'm just like, what? I'm like, no, it's a published book. This happened in 1799. And they just won't take it, right? Thank you, Hassan, for sharing. So, let's talk about the present. Azhar and Walid. I would love for you guys to tell everyone what you've witnessed at the camps. What does your organization do, Islamic Relief, do to aid the Rohingya? And what can we as Americans do to help?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. It's really an honor to be with this wonderful group of panelists. Once a wise man said, the world suffers a lot, not because of the violence of bad people, but because of the silence of good people. Just a few weeks back, I was in one of the largest Rohingya camps, which is in Bangladesh. So you fly into the capital city of Dhaka, and then you take another hour and a half long flight to Chittagong, and in the Chittagong district is this Cox's Bazar. Cox's Bazar is one of the most beautiful, tourist resort with beautiful beaches. A lot of foreigners come over there. And just an hour away from Cox's Bazar is the Ukhiya region, which houses 800,000 Rohingya refugees. So what the Bangladeshi government has done is that they have removed 3,000 acres of forest land and changed that into refugee camps. So as you can imagine, removing trees from the hills and from the plateau and from the plains really causes a serious ecological disaster. But they had to do this because they didn't have any other choice. And in this 3,000 acres of forest land, which is now the largest refugee camp for Rohingyas, where 800,000 refugees are living over there in a very challenging, in a very, I would say, difficult environment. These 800,000 refugees are divided into 32 camps, and there are 250 NGOs that are working over there. After 4 p.m., not a single aid worker is allowed to stay in the refugee camp because, as you can imagine, the refugees are very vulnerable individuals. A lot of abuse happens, and they vacate the entire area. The army makes sure that all NGOs are out of the camps by 4 p.m. every single day. Islamic Relief has been there for last 2 years. This is one of the largest, charity based out of US. We have been here for last 26 years. We have currently 9 offices across the country, 150 staff members, several thousand volunteers. Annual revenue is close to 140 million. And we have been inside Myanmar since 2012, and we have offices in Rakhine province since 2015. We have been partnering with UNHCR, and now we are taking care of these refugees in Bangladesh. I really have to applaud the people of Bangladesh for being so generous to host all these refugees. As you know, Bangladesh is not a very rich country. They themselves go through a lot of challenges, a lot of natural disasters, but still they were able to show their generosity in hosting these people. Now, every year, this part of Bangladesh faces a lot of heavy rains. Luckily, in last 1.5 years or 2 years, there haven't been heavy rains. And this has been a great blessing, because when it rains heavily, there are serious landslides, and majority of the camps are on hilltops. So, again, these refugees have to go through a very difficult time if it rains heavily. Now, since they are refugees, they are not allowed to build permanent structures or solid structures. What I mean by that is that concrete, metal, steel cannot be used in these camps. So all the tents that you find are made out of bamboos. The roofs are tarpaulin roofs. And Islamic Relief is running in this camps medical clinics that takes care of several thousand patients in a month. A majority of them are women and children. So in any given year, 60 to 70,000 patients, are seen by our doctors and staff over there. We have built tents for close to 15,000 refugees. The food distribution goes on a regular basis. We have also built safe zones for women and children. Women has gone through a lot. They see, a lot of, trauma and pain. So they need a place to come and talk to other women. We bring in experts who can talk to them, educate them, teach them about personal hygiene and other stuff. They also put some sort of henna on their hands, and they spend good number of hours in these safe spaces. Because once they do their work in their tents, cook food, cook meals for their families, they come over here and they spend time with their other women. We have also created safe spaces for young children. I met many women who were brutally gang raped, and they just fled Myanmar with a piece of cloth on their body. They couldn't carry anything else. When I sat over there and when I spoke to them, I cried with them. They cried with me. And the stories that they shared were absolutely horrific. It is so sad that in 2019, we see, a group of human beings treating other human beings, fellow human beings in this way, just because they look different, they have a different language, they have a different faith or tradition. It's so sad that we are seeing this kind of things in 2019. I met young children who will never be able to walk properly again because they tied jute, bags to their feet and they put it on fire. So their body parts were seriously burnt. I met many individuals who had, bullet wounds, and they are disabled for the rest of their lives. And these were the stories that was shared with us. In last 2 years, Islamic Relief has put in close to $3.5 million. They are working with CARE International. They also do something called as cash for labor, where men are given 400 takas, which comes to around $5 a day, where they help in building pavements, trying to put roads. What they do is they put bricks and they put sand on it, and then they put another layer of bricks and then sand on it so that vehicles can be driven on top of that, and basic commodities are taken to different parts of the camps. Situation is very challenging, very difficult. I spent close to 7 days over there. I documented a lot of, we did a lot of case studies, and we were able to document and, with their permission, record them and take pictures. Last but not least, I also want to share with you that one of the co-founders of Islamic Relief and the current president, he was able to go inside Myanmar. He visited Rakhine province. even though he was advised not to travel, but he took the risk because he just wanted to go and see the work that is going on over there, the projects that we have funded. He even had to shave off his beard because that's what he was advised. He was advised to go over there as a tourist. And the stories that he shared with me were extremely heartbreaking. I think the official numbers says that there were 6,800 deaths in last year and a half, but the number is much bigger, and the number is on the rise. What can we do? We live in the most prosperous nation on earth, the only superpower in this world. A lot could have been done, but unfortunately, the entire world, not only us, but the entire world has turned the other way, including the head of Myanmar, who is known as the first state counselor, Aung San Suu Kyi, a Nobel laureate, who herself went through a lot of struggle, was fighting for democracy. But when she took the reins of power, she did not utter a single word. She just basically looked the other way, and she has been very silent, which is very disheartening, and it's extremely tragic. We were hoping that somebody who was a political prisoner would be in the forefront to talk about the human rights of individuals who have lived in Myanmar for many years. But unfortunately, because of the reasons best known to her, she was extremely silent. I very strongly believe that all those groups, and there are not too many, who are working inside Myanmar and who are helping the refugees in Bangladesh, close to 800,000 refugees living now in Bangladesh. If you can adapt a project, support the work of those organizations who are providing basic necessities of life. If international aid is cut off, these people will starve to death. So if you can help organizations like Islamic Relief and others who are doing very important, critical, good work inside these refugee camps, I would urge you to go and support them. You can look at the work and do, read case studies at irusa.org.
Thank you so much. Walid?
Thank you. So, thank you for having me here. It's an absolute honor to be here with everybody. And I want to start off by greeting you with the greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum. And hello to all of you. Now, you mentioned earlier a statement that the UN made that the Rohingyans are the most persecuted people. Another statement that they made is that they're also the most friendless people in the world. That was a particular statement that actually struck a string with me. Because what I do, my background is, I'm a fundraiser essentially, which involves community development, community networking, and essentially trying to provide the aid or collecting the aid needed so that it can reach those individuals who are marginalized and those who are affected by the crisis that's going on. Now, one of the challenges that somebody such as myself faces, and it was mentioned earlier that this is not a new problem. And a lot of these crises that we see are not new problems. But we only really hear about these things when the hype comes on the news. When a big incident happens, there's a rush to get involved, to help out, and then the next thing pops up, and then it dies down. And we tend to forget. We tend to forget that there's a reality behind or beyond what we see just on the news. And it's something we can't really conceptualize because we don't live it. So when I go into communities and when I go into different places to essentially solicit the help needed to bring aid and relief and the development to the people of Myanmar and those refugees in neighboring countries, what I found is that that statement by the UN that they're the most friendless people is very accurate. And I'll tell you why. Every community I go to, whether they're minorities or not, they're affected by a certain crisis going on in the world today. You name the country and there's a crisis there, unfortunately. And everybody wants to help. Now the problem is when you talk about a situation like Myanmar or the Rohingyas, is there aren't really that many around. And there aren't that many who really know about the problem. So we might go to communities that are predominantly Middle Eastern and their focus is Middle Eastern, or communities that are African and their focus is the crisis in Africa. But when you go to different places, you don't necessarily see that many Rohingyans or that many people who are from Myanmar. And that's a direct result of the crisis that's going on. Now, in an emergency, there are different stages in what a relief organization such as Islamic Relief USA does. Typically, when you have poverty, you have assessments that need to be done, you have case studies, you have data that you can pull. But in a situation like Myanmar, where there's an emergency that happens, you have to react quickly. There isn't really any time. There's an immediate need. So we go to these places and we distribute the hygiene kits, the healthcare and food packets and different immediate needs, shelter kits and what have you. But the issue is that the problem persists. It doesn't stop there. And I'm sure you've all heard of the saying, you don't give a person a fish, you give them the education or the training on how to fish, right? You give them the fishing pole. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. Because in emergencies such as this one, these emergencies keep happening. This crisis keeps happening. These are persecuted communities where you help a certain area and then the next area is devastated and then the next area is devastated. And you can't move on to the next stages where you have to develop and actually make a lasting impact. You have to continuously provide that immediate aid. And so you have the situation such as the refugee crisis in the Cox's Bazar. And you have the refugee crisis in places like Indonesia where they've also left to. And if you ask them, and yesterday I was with one of our programs, international programs coordinators, and he had mentioned that they fled to Indonesia and they had to go by boat. And a lot of times what happens is when they want to leave, they have to essentially get smuggled there, right? Because this is not a legal means to get there. And so those who traffic them, they take it at a cost. There's a financial cost to it. And before they actually get to the hosting country or the supposed hosting country, a lot of times what happens is they're abandoned midway before they actually get there. So you're talking about hundreds to thousands of people on a boat who are going to another country. They have no idea where they're going or what's in store, with the intention that they're going to work and be able to provide a living and send it back home. But because they're not actually allowed there, they're abandoned on the way. And the trip itself takes a few months just to get there, approximately 5 months out in the ocean. And then they're abandoned and it takes another month with a very limited supply of food and water before they can actually get there. But what was interesting in Indonesia is that when they arrived there, and actually there was some local fishermen that helped them and actually got them there. They had met with the local Indonesians there and they had set up a refugee camp for them. And it was a very, very well-designed refugee camp. It was not one that you see in some of the other places where it's just tents and very infrastructure that's lacking any structural integrity. Top of the line infrastructure. But the issue is that they couldn't communicate because the languages were different. And so, as a result, they assumed that we're going to build them these very nice refugee camps, they're going to be able to stay there, and they should be fine. Well, our programs coordinator went there and he was able to communicate with some of the Rohingya refugees because they also spoke Urdu, which is what he spoke. And he asked them, so what do you think? How is it here? And they said, we're miserable. We're absolutely miserable. And he was surprised because this is one of the best refugee camps that he's seen. But they were miserable. And he asked why. They said, we're here trapped in a place where we don't speak the language, there's no guidance, and there are no opportunities to progress. We're just here. And he was struck. He said, well, you came all this way. It took you months to get here. Would you go back? And they said, we would go back in a heartbeat. Back to the place they were persecuted. And a few months following that, I believe it was maybe a year or so, those who organized the camps and were in charge, they ran a report and they showed that there wasn't a single one left, because that's not a life to live. And they decided to go back to persecution because there was no life there. There was no means of living. There was no means of sending income back to their families. So what Islamic Relief USA does, and we don't do it alone. We do it through our international partners. We do it through our supporters. We do it through our volunteers and through our staff. We provide the relief, the immediate assistance, but we also have to think long term. And that's the most important thing, is because we don't want to have to go and assist people who are in constant need. We want to make sure that people can help themselves, that they're self-sufficient and self-sustaining. But in a place where there's a constant emergency, it's very difficult. But we do have projects that we have set up that are headed in that direction. So, going to your last question, how can we help? Now, Azhar mentioned that helping, you definitely want to help organizations such as Islamic Relief and others with the assistance to help those, because international aid is very important. But something that we lack is that we're trying to hit the root of the problem. We're trying to get to the core. And sometimes humanitarian organizations are at the mercy of larger organizations or institutions that are in control of the situation. And that doesn't, and the permits or the restrictions are not conducive to actually getting to the root of the problem. So on top of actually supporting these organizations, it's incumbent that all of us get more involved and reach out to local officials to actually do something and actually influence those who are lawmakers and in control of policies to make it conducive for us to actually change what's going on. And I'm gonna end by saying that when you do support local organizations, it's very complex work overseas, because a lot of times people think, well, I have a jacket, I have clothes, I want to donate that, can I do that? Now you can, but that's not the ideal situation, because what happens is when you have large containers of goods and you send it there, if it doesn't get lost or stolen, you tend to disrupt the local community's economy with the influx of different products and merchandise. So financial aid is one of the best ways that you can support them through organizations, and on top of that, going to your local elected officials and making noise. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wanted to talk about, because you mentioned that in Indonesia, the camps, that it was one of the best camps that was made. And I keep running into sources that say that in Indonesia, there's also a big conflict between the Muslim community there and the Rohingya in terms of integration. That's another problem that they run into, is that not, just because they're Muslim doesn't mean that they're going to be accepted into a society that is predominantly Muslim, right? So that's another issue that I see, and obviously it has to do with language and it has to do with culture, right? And I feel like the Rohingya have had their identity just like taken from them. It's, you know, if they're in Myanmar, you're not Burmese because you're not a citizen. And if you're in Saudi Arabia or Pakistan or Indonesia and Malaysia, which are the places where there are the most refugees, they don't even get citizenship. And it's, you know, Hassan, what do you think defines the identity of a Rohingya aside from being stateless or a refugee?
Well, identity actually is very important for every human being. Like you don't feel like you're a human being. You feel like you don't belong to anywhere, and so I've been in that kind of situation, and I've seen how people live without you know identity and statelessness. So basically, for us, I mean, Rohingyas were actually citizens of Burma before 80s.
Right.
So
It was 1982 when they implemented the 1982 Burma citizenship law.
Right.
And they said before 1823, anyone who wasn't here, who can't prove documentation. And the irony of that is that you can't prove citizenship when your whole entire town has been burned to the ground and you have no deeds, nothing, right? So go on.
so basically, without identity, you don't feel like people don't treat you like a human being. They treat you like worse than animals. You have no rights, and basically, I think for us as Rohingyas, it means a lot because we've been through so much because of not being part of, not being allowed to be, let's say, participate in, let's say, country's economy, educational system,
Right.
so on and so forth.
Would you feel that you're closer to, when we've spoken in the past, it's always Rohingya American, right? But do you feel that your identity is more defined by what you have experienced in the United States or where you came from as a Rohingya?
Well, when I was living there, I didn't really think much of, let's say, I mean, Rohingya versus Burmese. I thought that this is my country. I was born here. I'm a Burmese. I really didn't think much about, why, I'm being treated differently. But I mean, I would question myself. But what I wasn't crazy about, let's say, you know, being, let's say, I have to be called. I mean, like getting a specific kind of, let's say, identity. I just wanted to be part of the country. So
You just wanted to be treated like a citizen, like a
yes,
human.
yes, human. So it doesn't matter if either they call me Rohingya or any other name. But I mean, but I just didn't feel like I belonged there. They didn't, the way they treated us.
And do you feel like you belong here?
Of course, I think whenever I go any other countries, I proudly say I'm American citizen, so I'm treated like somebody, you know, special because yeah, you belong to America. You know, you have this passport. But when I was living there, basically, I was told that you don't belong here. You are not from here. You know, you have no human rights, basically.
Thank you so much. At this time, I'll take any questions from the audience. Yes.
Yes, this is for the whole panelists. in regards to Prime Minister Suu Kyi, the National League for Democracy, her supporters believe that she's quiet because if she says anything, she'll make it worse. So, from the international community, what can you do to help her?
I would argue that is a cop-out for her defenders. She has not only remained silent, she has basically justified what's happened to the Rohingya. She's gone further than simple silence. If she had remained silent, I think one could make that, off of that explanation. It still is, in my view, is not sufficient. But she has treated journalist questions when they ask her about this with disdain, and she basically defends the policies of the army. So she's in a very difficult situation. I don't want to sit here and pretend that all she has to do is say the right things and the situation will change overnight. It definitely won't. If she were to criticize the military, it's possible the military would remove her from her position. But as Zara said earlier, this is someone who lived under house arrest for many years. Her father was killed by the Burmese military. This is someone who has fought and stood for human rights for decades. And now, in her current position of authority, she is failing the test to stand up and say at least what's right, even if she's not in a position to do what's right.
No, I fully concur with what David have said. I'm reminded of what Winston Churchill once said: an optimist sees an opportunity in every difficulty, and a pessimist sees a difficulty in every opportunity. I'm still optimist, but looking at the current situation, spending time with them, listening to stories directly from those individuals who have suffered a lot, I don't see anything positive happening in the near future. It is very sad. I don't know what's going to happen to these 800,000 refugees who are living in Bangladesh, because Bangladesh also is under tremendous pressure. They are facing a lot of challenges. I also want to share with you that in Bangladesh there is an entire diaspora, close to 1 million people, who migrated at the time of independence in 1947. They are called as overseas stranded Biharis. Overseas stranded Biharis. Bihar is a region in India, and they migrated from Bihar to Bangladesh. They sided with Pakistan when India and Pakistan became independent nations in 1947. And in 1971, when Bangladesh became an independent nation, these people were looked upon as supporters of Pakistan. So for last several decades, 3 or 4 decades, these individuals did not get their citizenships, they did not get their passports, they did not get any government jobs, they cannot basically serve in army or police department. They were just basically either selling goods on the street, or they were, taking up jobs of janitors and cleaning and those kind of things that they were doing. So Bangladesh already has an experience, and still there are 1 million such individuals who are living in Bangladesh, and they are living in refugee camps in areas called as Mirpur and Muhammadpur, which is on the outskirts of Dhaka. Now, with this 800,000 refugees who migrated from Myanmar into Bangladesh, we are grateful to the Bangladeshi people that they are hosting them as of now, but what is there for them in future is a big question mark. These people, if they go back to Myanmar, again they will be persecuted, again they will be tortured, again they will be treated inhumanely. So basically they cannot go back to Myanmar. How long are they going to survive in Bangladesh? We don't know. Unless and until international community comes together and puts pressure on the government of Myanmar and offer them packages through which they can rehabilitate these individuals, or take the responsibility and guarantee that their lives will be protected and they will be rehabilitated. And it sounds like a miracle, but unless and until such a thing happens, I don't see anything positive happening. Also, last but not least, in my conversations with some of the elders, they confessed that there is this economic corridor that is being put together between China, India, and Myanmar. Rakhine province has a lot of natural resources, and that entire region is being vacated because economically it's going to be beneficial to these three countries. So that was also very alarming, and also at the same time very surprising to know that there were some economics involved in creating this man-made disaster, and then entire population is being vacated from that part. So again, what lies in the future, nobody can say. But as individuals, again, I want to reiterate, living in the most prosperous, most powerful nation on earth, we can definitely reach out to our lawmakers and urge them to do more. We can help humanitarian organizations who can basically do important work to sustain them and to help them. And at the end of the day, with our persistent efforts, something positive may come out of it.
Thank you.
I want to say a few things in response to your question. Aung San Suu Kyi, when she was asked by a reporter about the atrocities committed against the Rohingyas and mass exodus, she said, I don't know why so many people are fleeing the country. So also, she has been very, very unsympathetic to the treatment of Rohingyas. It's been it's been going on for many, many years. When one asked, she said, atrocities committed by both sides, even though Rohingyas only 5% of the population. So she said, both sides, the Rakhines and Rohingyas both are victims. So even though vast majorities of people that are victims are Rohingyas, and you know, one asked the release of Rohingyas in internment camps. So she said, we have no place for them to go, even though they have been living there for generations, centuries. So they are not recent migrant, So it's like simply they can't go back to their home because homes are destroyed, of course. So she also said that it's impossible for them to integrate with the population or go back to their villages. And she has gone so far to refuse to let United Nations observers into northern Rakhine State. Uh, One can cynically state Aung San Suu Kyi has joined the ranks of other Nobel Peace winners, including, war criminals. I'm not going to mention the names. There are so many. Um, so this is the her view or opinion on the Rohingyas. So people actually thought when I was young, they thought that maybe someday the country will change for better when when we have democracy. So she was campaigning for a change to bring country into let's say to turn country into democracy, But sadly, when she came into power, things got much worse. Um, so yeah, that's all I have to say, I
Yeah.
guess.
In 2012, she was released, and I was already working on my big project, and I was heartbroken when I heard about her story, and, I was like, okay, well, so, I started investigating, and I was, wow, she was imprisoned while her husband passed away, and she didn't get to watch her children grow up. This is some really harsh stuff, right? And I thought, okay, well, things are really looking up in 2015. When she was finally elected and became a fundamental part of the government, right? Nothing changed, and as Hassan said, everything got so much worse, and she refuses to acknowledge any of it. And furthermore, I think that what has damaged her reputation for me the most is that she continues to contribute to the rhetoric that vilifies the Muslim community as rapists and as violent. That's my take. Yes, Dr. Steer.
So thank you, Griselle, so much for organizing this panel. I'm Oren Steer. I direct the Holocaust and Genocide Studies program here, and we're really thrilled to be co-sponsors of this event. I also teach for the Masters in Global Affairs program, and I teach the course on religion, violence, and conflict there, and my students were tasked with addressing this problem and trying to come up with solutions. So some things I want to throw back to the panel, because I agree with everything that's been said, but there are also some structural issues. So for example, you're absolutely right about the kind of soft denial that is peddled by Aung San Suu Kyi and others that definitely contribute to part of the problem. But another one of the issues is that structurally the government is not a democracy. And structurally, it's actually impossible for any real change to happen because the military has a lock on the way things are done there. That's just kind of like a reality on the ground. I guess one question of the three I'm going to ask, one question to the panel is, how can the international community somehow put pressure on the Myanmar government itself to change the way they do business? Because right now, there's really no option for change. The second thing is, we recognize that the international community has completely failed. But one thing that doesn't get talked about enough is how much the regional governments have failed, and how much the perpetuation of this huge humanitarian refugee disaster is continued because the governments there will not really take the extra steps necessary to try to absorb the communities, to try to deal with the challenges of citizenship and work and the things that would allow the refugee community to somehow survive this huge upheaval in their lives. And I think that's a really big question. We know the international Western community is forget about it. They're useless. But is there anything regionally that could be done? And again, can we somehow put pressure there? And then finally, the third thing, much appreciation for the words of peace, wa alaikum assalam. But what about the global Muslim community? Why hasn't the global Muslim community stepped up on a grand scale to address this problem?
Thank you so much for your question. I truly applaud you for the work that you're doing here at the university. Thank you so much. I remember when President Obama was in the office, I had the good fortune to visit the White House very frequently, and sometimes we used to provide our input and feedback. And in his State of Union address and in his public discourse, he highlighted the plight of Rohingyas. So when the president of one of the most powerful nations on earth, when he talks about this issue, the entire missionary starts working in that direction to highlight the plight of the Rohingyas and also try to garner support. That has not been the case in last 2 years. Number two, I just want to say that I want to admit very honestly that the Muslim world is going through a lot of chaos. There is, there are nations that are ruled by brutal dictators, nations who were under colonial rule, nations who had people who were, running the affairs of the nation with an iron fist. And you cannot expect, those nations or head of those nations to take such principal position, because these are not democracies. These are sheikdoms and kingdoms and autocracies. So that is the ground reality. Now, This doesn't mean that overwhelming majority of Muslims from all over the world, especially Muslims who are living in the Western world, they have not done their part. They have been doing their utmost best. I want to share with you that American Muslims in particular, they give close to $1 billion in zakat every single year. And this money is going for humanitarian causes in different parts of the world. And it's also helping some of the challenges that we see here in our own backyard. Whenever there are natural disasters, whenever there are situations. So American Muslims are definitely doing their part. I have been to 38 nations around the world, so I can, and of course, majority of them are in Middle East, in Africa, in Europe. So I can definitely also speak on behalf of Muslims who are living in Canada, in UK, in France, in Australia. They're all doing their utmost best. These are individuals who have come into the Western world. They have thrived under democracy. They enjoyed the pluralistic environment, and their perception on issues have changed. And these very same individuals have been the biggest critics of the Muslim world. And this is a documented fact. We have to basically also ask some of our leaders who consider, Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates as their biggest allies, and they have a horrible human rights record. So you call somebody as your friend, and you basically put them on a higher pedestal because there is a business deal that you need $400 billion from them, and then you overlook everything else that they have been doing. So. And same thing in Egypt, same thing in other parts of the world. So we have to really look at this whole issue in a very balanced way. And I concur with you, but I just want to also clarify what you have said.
Yeah, I'll also mention something. As Azhar said, there is a very big disconnect between the Muslim population around the world and those who technically lead them, right, or claim to lead them. And the influences comes from those who claim to lead them. And that's where the problem is, and that's where it gets very complex. And you had mentioned earlier that, the Western international community forget about them. But the thing is, we can't really forget about them, right? It's because a lot of times, what happens around the world involves really everybody around the world, right? And Muslims, especially within the West, Europe, and wherever outside of the so-called Muslim world, are the ones who are spearheading a lot of these campaigns. Because we understand that in countries that claim to be democracies, we know that this is where change is really going to take place. As a humanitarian organization, one of the issues that we face is that when we go into a country such as Myanmar, and the leaders or the government or whatever is spending their resources to essentially create these refugees or the situation that you have. As a humanitarian organization, when you go and you aid the people and you provide for them, the question is, or the dilemma is, are you also contributing to the problem? Because now you're essentially allowing these people to be funded without those who are responsible for them to actually take the problem on their shoulders. But on the other side of that is, if you don't do it, people will die, right? And that's the problem that a lot of humanitarian organizations have to face. So here in the West, as Muslims and non-Muslims, it's up to us to really do something and put pressure. And historically speaking, you'll notice from different crises or wars in the past, such as the Korean War or the Vietnam War, when did change really start happening? It's when people got up and made it an issue. Now, today, a lot of us don't really trust in the system, so to speak, right? But we don't really have a choice. The only choice we really have is to make noise and to pressure those who are influencers and policymakers. And that's what we do, or that's what we have to do. And like I said, it's not a Muslim or a non-Muslim issue, this is a human issue. So that's it.
Thank you so much, everyone. I hope your question was answered, Dr. Steer. Thank you for those of you who stayed. I know we went over time. Thank you for attending. Have a great day.